What's up, guys? Doug Polk here, and today is the official launch of the Upswing Poker mixed game course taught by Jake Abdalla. Now, the course is going to have over 30 hours of content from Jake, as well as me for a couple videos as well, and it's going to cover stud, raz, stud high-low, Omaha 8 or better, and triple draw. Now, this course is going to cost $1,000, and it's going to be $500 off if you buy between January 3rd and 8th. In today's video, I got Jake on a call, and we're going to go through and look at some of the more interesting hands that Jake has played in '08 so we can understand how to play the game, maybe learn a few things along the way. One last thing before we jump into the video. Normally when Upswing launches an advanced course in a different area, there are people that feel like the course is too expensive and that it doesn't make sense for it to be priced that way. And I totally understand where you're coming from. I know these courses are on the more expensive side, especially given what coaching is out there. But at Upswing, we have a standard of bringing in some of the best players in the entire world and putting together really good courses. You know, you can trust us to put together something that you're going to learn from, that you're going to have a qualified coach, that the material will be good, that the video quality is going to be good. You know, there's a certain standard that we set ourselves to make sure that the courses are appropriate. So on that note, let's go ahead and jump into our '08 coaching session with Jake Abdalla. All right, we are now joined by the instructor for the Upswing Poker mixed game course, Jake Abdalla. Thank you for joining us today and helping us out with our mixed games.
Hey, Doug. Happy to be here. Excited to go through some hands from other games.
Nice, yeah. And so today we're going to be looking at just one of the mixed games. It's going to be Omaha 8 or better. But before we start looking at some hands we got prepared here, can you maybe tell us a little bit about why you think that mixed games are, a valuable skill set for a poker player to have?
Yeah, so mixed games are great because a lot of recreational players really like the variety and like to play a whole bunch of different games. And, being able to play a lot of games well allows you to play in kind of the best game in the room or the best game on the site at all times. And that's just really valuable within itself. Also, no limit. People are starting to resent it a little. There's too many solvers. There's too many wizards. And, things are starting to move in a wider direction.
Yeah. Also, when you look at like the top tier of like poker games, and this may be something for people striving to get to the highest stakes in poker, oftentimes the biggest games will be mixed games because certain people think there's one game they're better at, or they have an edge because of the lineup or whatever. And you look at Bobby's room; it's primarily mixed games these days.
Yeah, definitely. And most players are only good at one or two games, so there's going to be a lot of mistakes you can profit off of.
Yeah, and I certainly wouldn't want to be one of those people. Okay, let's go ahead and jump into some hands here, guys, as I use my extremely professional video recording skills. Okay, so we have 4 different '08 hands that we're going to go ahead and run through here. Generally speaking, I'm going to be just asking Jake questions, maybe giving a little bit of input, but we're going to leave the strategic advice to the experts here. So let's go ahead and jump in and talk about this first hand, Jake.
Okay, sounds good. So we're here with ace-7-7-4 in the big blind. It's a pretty solid hand. If it's suited to the ace, you might want to go ahead and squeeze here to this action. But I think here you're fine with just a call.
All right, we do make the call.
So obviously a very nice looking flop for us. We have middle set, and for our low draw, we have ace-2-4-7, which is the second best possible low draw at this time. The button goes ahead and c-bets, and we're going to be looking to put some money in here as soon as we can.
So let me actually just ask a couple questions here. Already this action's getting a little diced. We got a bet and a raise going. But let's talk about like how important your low draw is, because I think one of the difficult things when you come from just a game where it's just only going to a high hand. Right now we have high and low. I guess sometimes it's difficult to understand like the true value of like different low hands. Like how much better is having like a bad low, a hand that can make a bad low versus no low, and how much better is it having ace-4 here than like ace-3 or ace-5? Like, can you kind of quantify like just low draws in general?
Yeah, sure. So low draws are pretty important, but the level of importance does also matter with how many players are in the pot and how many players are in the game. So when at a full table from earlier positions, ace deuce is king, and a lot of hands people play are going to have specifically ace deuce in them because they draw to the best low half. Then as you move on, a lot of ace threes are thrown in, then some ace fours, and by the time you get to like a blind battle, any two low cards has a reasonable chance of winning half the pot. So in this situation, the two on the flop means that a lot of the ace two hands are kind of unhappy to see this board. So obviously ace three would be the best, but ace four is a solid runner up. Not to mention that if a three comes out, then we do have the best possible low.
So would you say that versus like early to mid position raises, you want to be really careful with hands that make bad lows, but maybe against a button open or against maybe like a small blind limp, then all of a sudden having hands that can draw to some not so great lows is much stronger.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, any low draw is going to have non-zero value, but it can be pretty small versus a tight range. You kind of have to start just hoping they have a hand like just aces with no low, or that their low card pairs the board and that they don't complete their low.
Also, just for some total newbies here for this video, in order to make a low in '08 or in stud 8, you have to have 5 cards that are an 8 or lower. So an ace through an 8, different ranked. If you pair the card to the board, you can't use both. You have to only use one. So you need 3 cards on the board in order to make a low. All right, so let's go back to this hand here. We got a bet, we got a raise. We got a pretty strong hand here, right? With the second nut high, as well as the second nut low draw. I assume this is the kind of hand where we're looking to either re-raise, or how would you approach this when you're facing a bet and a raise?
Well, it's going to be somewhat rare to face this action, so you don't need to go too crazy with trying to mix up or balance. You're going to want to just pretty much re-raise right away and not slow play in this game nearly as much, since the board's always changing. So this is going to be a pretty clear spot to just put in as much action as possible here on the flop. We're pretty happy to see this action in front of us.
Can we talk about this decision here? Button decides to go ahead and 4-bet after we 3-bet. When you're in the small blind here, do you ever feel like you're getting kind of squeezed? Would you ever make like a little bit more of a conservative laydown when this action is happening? I mean, you're up against 2 hands that are both going to be fairly strong ranges. We look at a 3-bet and a 4-bet. Should you be proceeding a little carefully here in the small blind?
Yeah, I mean, you can be a little more careful going on in the hand. I still think, his immediate odds are going to be really attractive here. The pot is already 11.25 before I put the last call in. So he's getting insane odds, and his hand was already good enough to check raise the flop. So he doesn't really have any hands that can get out at this point in the hand, but he does have to be pretty afraid that, there are sets out here and nut flush draws, and obviously a lot of low draws as well.
Right, so he makes the call, and we call it caps at 4 bets, right? That's the cap on the flop.
Correct, yeah.
Okay.
4-bet cap.
Okay, so we get the 9 of spades in the turn. This is actually a very interesting card now because I am familiar with how nut flush blockers work, and they seem less good when you can only bet a very small amount. But at least you know that no one here has the nut flush.
Yeah, that's right. And given that we have it and the strength of our low, strength of our redraw to the high and our low draw, I think we can go ahead and keep betting it. Although it's fairly likely that someone has a flush at this point, but you never know what might happen. The button specifically in this game also is a very, very aggressive player on the flop, so we can expect to have he won't necessarily be thrilled to see the next bet go in here.
Gotcha. So do you know both these players?
Yeah, the button is Anthony Zeno, mainly known for tournaments, but he mixes it up with '08 as well. And the small blind is Matt Ashton, who's a very strong mixed game player. He won the 50K Poker Players Championship a few years back.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. So turn completes the flush. You bet. Button raises. So he's saying that he's got like a decent flush here at least. Do you think he'd be raising? I assume he's gonna be calling most flushes, right? Given the flop action.
I mean, that's what I would expect, particularly with me having the ace of spades here. So the fact that he's raising is a little questionable. I mean, it tells me that maybe he has some reason he wants to shut out the small blind. Maybe his draws aren't so nutted, and he wants to have have full range of that half of the pot. But it is definitely a little bit surprising to see.
Do you think there's maybe any merit if he has a hand like a set and the nut low draw to raising here to try and uh, the thing is, no one's folding a flush though, and does anyone even really fold a straight in this spot? It would be kind of a tough spot with a straight, actually.
Yeah, it would be a tough spot. I think a straight without much else would fold. That being said, in a game like 08, you don't have a ton of 10-8 combinations with this pre-flop plus this action. It's going to be way more likely people have flush draws, low draws, these types of hands. But yeah, I don't mind him raising. If he had a set with, say, the ace of spades, like my hand, then it would be a great spot to raise because his low draw would become live. And, I think that the small blind actually might fold some low flushes if he didn't have a strong low redraw himself.
What would you do in the small blind here if you had a hand like, let's just say, let's say you had the nut low draw. Are you worried about the way that this can go where, first off, someone could have that as well and you could chop even if you get there? When it goes bet raise, how often is it going to get 3-bet? Are you still just calling here if you have a hand like ace jack 3? Are you going to call here on the turn, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm still going to call. In a spot with more players where you're up against multiple people that are likely to have ace deuce, and you have kind of just bare ace deuce. You can make some cases to get away from these situations since you're playing for like a quarter of the pot. But when it's three ways, button, two blinds, and it's an aggressive game, you're still going to have the best low draw enough of the time that you really don't want to give up when there's this much money already in the pot.
All right, fair enough. So he does make the call. Now back to you here. I would assume you're going to call, but you look a little you look a little mischievous. So I don't know. Where are we going here?
Well, at this point, I decided, I have, definitely I'm up against at least one flush almost all the time, but I blocked the nut flush, and, it's possible that there's a weaker flush in here that's trying to make its low. And I just decided that, the equity of my low draw plus my boat draw, and then the small chance I might get some hero folds on a blank river, decided to just go for it here. It's a small fraction of the pot, given how big the pot is at this size. And, no one's going to be able to raise me again, given that they can't have the nuts. So I just decided to, you can occasionally make some slightly out of line plays to, as the exception to the time when you mostly just want to have what you're representing.
Yeah, well, like I guess the weird thing is like when I look at a play like this, I think about how like I would want to use a blocker that's like a worse hand because our hand is still just so good. We have a set and like the second nut low draw, but I guess you're not really gonna have too many hands you're three betting the flop with that can even be weak on the turn here, right?
Yeah, that's definitely true. It's You can't really be super weak here, and unlike no limit, it's not going to be so much like you want to pick hands that are just too that you would otherwise be folding. Here, it's just this isn't like a mandatory go for it, but it is a reasonable spot to do it because you just might get someone to fold half the pot on a river blank, where one guy might have a low flush, miss his low draw, and just decide, oh, he's in the middle now. There's no way he's good here. Because, very vast majority of the time with this action, someone has the nut flush, and which is why it's actually so strange to get raised on the turn. So, I mean, a player that knows how to read hands is at least going to consider getting away when it's, quote, so obvious that I must have the nut flush.
So what kind of ranges are you putting both these players on? I feel like the button is kind of saying he's got like I feel like the button's saying he has a flush. And I feel like the small blind is saying that he's got either something along the lines of like a set or like a good low draw or what kind of hands are you putting them on?
Yeah, those ranges are pretty reasonable. I mean, again, as we mentioned, the raise from the button is a little unusual, but it would make some sense for him to have some kind of flush here that maybe a lower flush that also has maybe a non-nutted low draw that's hoping it can kind of free up one half of the pot or the other. And then the small blind could have probably is going to have some mainly low draws, maybe with some other backup to go with it. Could be like two pair and a low draw, or some kind of set is possible as well, for sure.
I guess the small
All,
blind even really could have a flush. I mean, there's not really much another way to play a flush here on the turn.
yeah, and if he has a flush without a decent low backup, and and the flush is low, he might even just lay it down here on the turn. So it is, it's hard to say exactly what they have, but somewhere in that wheelhouse. Ace three being kind of the most likely holding I would think that he could have. So this is probably a bad river for him if that's what he had.
Wouldn't it be better? Because I feel like having a set here kind of sucks for this play, just because like you kind of want them to have a set. I think if they have a set, call and then end up having to call a turn, those hands just can probably get away from a brick river, where flushes are so likely. But you actually block like Jack 7, 7, 7. Are you at all worried about that aspect of it?
Well, the thing, I mean, it is rare to get in this spot, and the thing is, when he does raise, he doesn't really have Jack 7 and 7 7 anymore. So, I mean, you could say the first bet, like unlike in a big bet game, I'm not like putting him to the test here and seeing if I can get him to fold a set like on the turn. So, I mean, given the action, I don't really have other options of what to sort of semi bluff with. And also my raw equity is just still pretty substantial. Like the tiny percent chance that I could get someone to lay down a flush on certain rivers, plus all the times I'm going to just win the pot one half or the other or both, really just adds up to like make it more justifiable to kind of spew in this situation for for a min bet.
All right, so back to you here now. You've got, I would say, probably one of your best rivers. Um,
Yeah.
what are your thoughts now? Keep betting, trying to maybe get some value for the low, and then also, I mean, I just can't. Here's the thing: other than maybe a straight that would have folded the turn, I just can't see betting really getting anyone off of a flush. So I assume the idea here is to bet and then get some value from worse lows.
Yeah, so mainly betting for value with the nut low here. I don't think it's completely impossible that a hand that got their low counterfeited on the river that had some kind of low flush would fold here. If they're experienced, they should really just expect to pretty much always be up against a higher flush. So they probably wouldn't because they're getting ridiculous odds. But it only takes once in a blue moon to make this completely crushing.
Right.
Again, I wouldn't say like a big goal of mine is to get people to fold flushes, but it's not like beyond the realm of possibility.
All right, so I mean, the way that this played out, you're just chopping the pot, but you got maximum value here from the small blind.
Yeah, and I think what Zeno was trying to do there was fold out maybe some hands like Ace 3, Ace 4 from the small blind to make his low draw live again. I think that may have been what he was kind of going for there. Now, if he had missed, would he have folded his 6 high flush? Probably not, but he would be very unhappy. He might consider it. He shouldn't really expect to ever win unless I have specifically, an out of control hand like this.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like part of the problem with raising on the turn is that, I mean, it's tough because I feel like when you raise, if the big blind was trying to bluff, with the blocker, it's weird because the bets are so small, but it just seems like you bloat the pot for the high where now your equity is just dead. And then I don't think you're really getting hands like Ace 3 to fold anyway. Maybe you get an Ace 4 to fold. So is there really that much merit to raising the turn?
You mean the 3-bet or his raise?
His raise.
Oh, it's pretty speculative. I don't really like it. But I could make a case for it because if he could ever get Ace 3 or Ace 4 to fold the small blind, then given the size of the pot, he has pretty good, pretty good equity at the low. And then if he ever could get like an 8 or 10 high flush to fold or Jack high flush, if Ashton had a hand like Jack 10 9 7 2 I mean, it's
That
really
can't play
tough.
pre. There's no way that
Yeah.
hand plays pre-flop.
Yeah, I don't think he would flat that pre. I mean, some players might, but I don't think he would. So I don't know how Zeno views the situation, but he might think just that the pot's so big that maybe something good will happen if he raises here. Generally, I think he's just he's just asking for trouble. But
All right, let's move on to the next hand here. 10-10 3 deuce. The kind of hand in PLO that you hate to play, but in 08, all of a sudden we have a pretty good hand, right?
yeah, it's a nice hand. It's especially good heads up. It doesn't play very well in big ring situations when you're up against a lot of ace deuce, and the tens. The tens are pretty vulnerable once you get the third player in there.
So what are your thoughts here? And this is actually maybe a good time to talk about the different kinds of flops in 08. So how the strategy that you want to be using will often come down to the texture of the board. And rather than in like no limit or PLO, where we're talking about either dry or wet textures, I think that in 08, the way that you more often look at it is, is each card high or low? And of course, high cards are 9 through king, and low cards are ace through 8, or deuce through 8 with also ace. And the way that those flops play are very different. If the flop comes 3 high cards, there is no low possible in the hand. So that means that the entire pot will be going to the high hand. If there are 2 high cards and 1 low, it could come out backdoor low, but again, it's much more likely it's going to end up being high only. So, playing for the high becomes more important. Once you get into 2 low card territory, it's now, it's a favorite that there will be a low in this hand. And so you have to be much more aware of low draws. And of course, with 3 lows on board, it's going to be a split pot no matter what. So the way that you want to proceed will change a lot on a board like ace 4 deuce, which is all low cards, compared to the last board, which was jack 7 deuce with 2 lows. Do you have anything on that subject you'd want to say, Jake? Maybe I said something wrong, or that would you?
No, I for the most part agree with all you said there. It's worth noting that when the board is all low and it's like 3 wheel cards, which is the ace through 5, the ranges can be a lot more kind of polarized, because if you have a wheel, you have close to the nuts both ways. You have the nut low plus a very strong high, and then if you don't have the wheel, you have a much weaker hand that's usually going to be good for half or none. So there can be a dynamic on these low boards of just some extra aggression because of the nature of of how different it is to have the wheel or not have the wheel.
Gotcha. Okay. So big blind calls, checks to you on this flop. I'm not sure if I'm right or not. I've actually not looked at these hands at all, so I have no idea what's going to happen here. I see this hand, and like maybe from my no limit or the way that I view poker background, it feels like a check, because we have like a pretty good low draw, but not an amazing one. And then we also have a kind of marginal high hand that if we get raised won't have very much value. Am I totally off base here, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I picked these hands out because they might surprise you. It is not terrible to check this back. And I would say that earlier when I started playing, I checked back hands like this a lot more often. The problem is when you have like bottom pair or a middle pocket pair, they're just so weak in terms of being able to get them to showdown, to realize all their equity. By the time you get to the river, there's so many weird 2 pairs that come up. There's so many like just weird overcards that now beat you for the high, that your 10s are like super vulnerable here the times that they are good. And similarly, like it's a flop that kind of favors the buttons range, and you're pretty happy to just get a fold for 1 bet in here some of the time. And you're going to realize your equity better by just putting pressure on the early streets and then maybe just shutting it down on the river. So I do think these hands kind of realize better by just betting when they're vulnerable and they block the key wheel card.
And that's actually also a pretty good point here, because in 08 it's a little bit different than in games like No Limit Hold'em, where the big blind's going to have to defend almost anything against a raise, because you're going to be calling 1 big blind to win 4.5 big blinds. And you get 4 cards. So
yeah,
it's kind of hard to not be getting enough equity to defend with the majority of hands. I'm going to just go out on a limb and assume versus a button open, you're going to be defending at least 90% or 95%. So you're going to have all kinds of hands, whereas the button open, you're going to have to open a little more conservatively in this game, because you're not getting folds. You're probably taking a flop, and then, there could be raises. So realistically, you're going to almost always have to have a lot of equity in the pot to even come in for a raise, which means the ace high boards are going to be much better for you. Those wheel hands Ace, basically any of the hands that can make good lows are almost always going to be opens. I assume probably even always going to be opens on the button. And so this board becomes a lot better for the opener. So, when you look at ace high boards, as the opener, are you mainly going to be betting on those textures with everything, or are there any ace high board spots where you might start considering a check?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think you need to be betting 100% of your range, particularly as the button, which is a bit wider than some of the earlier positions. But you want to have a very high bet frequency on these type of boards because they do really they hit you a lot better than they hit the big blind. And also will depend some on your button opening strategy, and that's actually a topic I cover a lot in the course. It's a pretty interesting topic, opening the button. But
Okay, cool. So we bet, we face a check raise. I mean, obvious call. I don't see any.
Okay, so in this spot, I
Uh-oh.
think a call would be the standard. But again, I went from some exciting hands here. The thing is, if somebody in more aggressive games, these wheel boards they get a little more polar in that people decide to check raise them more aggressively, especially more aggressive players. So in a live game, I definitely wouldn't want to go to war here. But when somebody is going to be check raising you with like even some of their really weak lows, like their 5-7s, or even a hand like 4-5-5-9, because they have blockers or what have you. You do want to have some ability to play back against that. So I don't mind kind of going for the 3-bet with a few hands that block the 3 here, that are kind of vulnerable, that have some value, but that you don't really want to just call this down unimproved, and it's pretty hard to improve the high. If you improve the low, then you have there's 4 to a wheel on the board already, basically, if you make it. So you by re-raising and then betting the turn, you hope to fold out some of their bluffs, and you can always shut it down on the river as well.
Yeah, so I guess like maybe can you expand a bit on when to do these moves and when not to? Because if we show 4 hands and every hand is you just going crazy, then people will be like, "Oh wait, you just bend raise and that's basically it, right?" So how do you pick like what hands you want to go for it with, or when you go for it?
So I mean, the best way to do it is if you see a spot where you realize, where you recognize that you have to kind of play back some without having it, then I would just pick hands that kind of play awkwardly as a call downs. You're not going to have and then of course you can have a few that call to raise turn. So maybe if you have like the flush draw, straight draw, tons of things going for you, you have so much equity that you can bluff raise the turn and afford to call a 3-bet. But a hand like this, it's much more expensive to put action on the turn than it is on the flop. So if I decided to turn this into a bluff somewhere, I would have to be kind of just raise folding it, because of how large the bets are. So I would mostly pick out of, just recognizing spots, recognizing your opponents, how aggressive they are. This isn't going to be your typical spot to go to spew versus just anyone. But as games get more and more aggressive, you have to pick certain hands to do it with. And, when in doubt, you could always randomize somehow, do it half the time or whatever.
Seems fair. At this point, when you get check raised, you're going to be kind of priced in just to call, right? You're not going to be able to fold anyway.
Yeah, it's between call and 3-bet for sure. Yeah.
All right, so check call on the turn. I'm going to go ahead on a limb and call this a pretty good river.
Yeah, we made a straight. We made a wheel. It's a good river.
So why just call here on the river and why not raise?
Okay, so when he leads out, he's representing he either has a wheel or a flush, or sometimes a straight to the 6, 3-6. If he has any combination of those hands, he's going to win more than half the pot. And any of those hands, he's going to win half the pot. So when we face this bet, we have no possibility of making money besides sometimes getting half and sometimes getting a quarter. So there's really no incentive to raise. If for some reason he did have a hand outside those 3 categories, he would just fold it to a raise anyway, because it would just be a pure bluff. So we really have no upside to raising here. If he does have a flush and a low, he's going to 3-bet and he's going to win, he's going to win the extra 3/4 of the pot that he will be able to inflate.
Gotcha. Okay, so even though this call is obviously printing, and we're doing pretty well against his range overall, we're just not doing anywhere near enough to raise because this lead is somewhat polar.
Yeah, I mean, we can never win more than half the pot really against that lead, unless he's just like completely spazzing out. So as we can see, he did have two of the three hands. Thankfully, he didn't have the one we have, so we do chop the pot. But if the six had been a deuce and he had the 3-8 of spades, then he would win 3/4 of the pot.
What do you think about his line here?
His line is completely fine. I think his flop check raise is pretty standard. It's the kind of play that you want to be making to put pressure. He blocks a wheel card. He has a very solid low. Then of course he turns the flush draw, so he's not going to be going anywhere. Um, on a brick river, I expect that he'll probably just go ahead and show down. But from my perspective with the tens, it might work out okay for me because I could shut down the river and actually chop with my tens as the high. And I would also, in that scenario, be getting to show down cheaper than just calling his check raise bet. Since the size of the bet doubles, I actually save money in that particular action sequence by putting in the extra bet on the flop.
The classic free showdown raise from limit, right? Isn't it something like that? Or
yeah, well, the classic one I think is the turn to check the river. Or the flop to check the turn, but the flop to bet the turn and check the river is just a derivative of that.
All right, it's interesting stuff here. Let's move on to our third hand. All right, Ace King Jack 10. Now, this is the opposite of the last hand. When I see this one, I'm thinking we have a great PLO hand, but unfortunately, we were not playing PLO.
That's correct. It's it's playable, but it's going to it's not by any means a premium hand. There are going to be flops that you don't want to put any action in on. Once the small blind limps, we do want to be attacking this with somewhere around 3/4 of our hands. So anything that looks nice is going to be worth a raise here, and this certainly looks nice.
That's some upper tier strategy. I like it. All right, so small blind limp calls, high low board, Jack 10-5. Kind of a lot going on here though.
Yeah, there's a lot of possibilities on this board.
But only one possibility for us, which is bet. All right.
Yes, we're going to go ahead and bet our top two pair. That's going to be a pretty much a standard play. Now the question is, facing check raise, do we want to re-raise or just call?
I kind of like a call here, even though I think
Over.
Am I going to be wrong here on all of them? No, I kind of like a call just because I feel like this texture can change so much on the turn that getting to keep the pot a little more manageable and then looking to raise some turn bets on brick turns can be a pretty good play. Or do you prefer to always just fast play it here and try and get some value?
I actually think this is really close, and that both of those are pretty reasonable approaches. The case for just calling is kind of what you said. There's so many board changing cards that you're not going to want to you're going to want to shut it down a lot of turns and not continue putting money in the pot. On the other hand, if you think you're getting check raised at a pretty wide frequency and that you have like a solid equity edge, your hand is so vulnerable that there are a lot of turns you're not going to be able to raise. And furthermore, you might actually find yourself able to check back some of those turns if they're really unfavorable for you. So by 3-betting on the flop, you can push, whatever edge you may have with top two while it's safe to push that edge. And you may end up having the opportunity to put less money in on a bad card as well.
Also, a pretty good top two here with the gut shot to the nuts here as well.
Yeah, nice to have a little bit of backup. Obviously, it could still be a lot better, but.
All right, so he's getting serious here. We got a 4-bet in the flop. Now, I imagine one of the problems with lines like this is that you really this can only be so many hands, right, that are willing to 4-bet the flop. Well, what kinds of holdings do you see wanting to 4-bet the flop?
So here, once we see the 4-bet, that means something a lot more significant than the check raise, where check raise frequencies are pretty high in these limit games, but check raise 4-bet is going to be more of a narrow range. I would expect to be seeing things like straight draw plus flush draw sets, maybe some hands with like jack, like queen jack 10-9 or king queen jack 10 are possible as well. Two pair with a flush draw is out there. I could definitely see this with even just bottom two and a flush draw, just because he has equity and he doesn't want me taking free cards or anything like that. Pretty good turn.
Decent turn. Decent, I would say. I mean, it could have been the... Oh, actually, no.
That was the one.
All right, so now he bets the turn. Are we raising now? Are we calling now? You want maybe consider each option, talk about them a little bit?
Sure. So the obviously we have the nuts. Now usually in limit games you don't want to really be slow playing, but there are some exceptions. So if I think that a lot of the time he's doing this with some kind of combo draw, and then he's going to go ahead and follow up on the turn. If I raise here and he just has a flush draw, straight draw, he, at this point with this much action, he might just decide that my range is pretty much but just boats, and he might actually bet fold some of his big draws. So there is some merit to trapping in this spot and just hoping that he rivers a flush, and that we can get maybe 2 bets out of him on the river, or even 1 bet out of him on the river, and not really give him the opportunity to just bet fold. Also, the fact that we have no diamonds ourselves makes that scenario a bit more likely as well.
So you prefer call?
Yeah, I think this is actually a pretty good spot to go for a trap.
I was gonna say raise, or I was gonna say call, but like you've just raised so many times, I can only say it so much. All right,
I
so
will
we do
say
call.
if there's any low possible on the board, then you definitely shouldn't slow play, because just if they have any type of low draw, they're not folding. So you should just get all that value in whenever there's a low possible out there.
Another thing that's nice about this hand when you trap is that really the only river where you're not going to have basically the nuts is a queen.
Right.
So you actually like can improve to higher boats. So like maybe if you had a hand more like Jack 10 8, I mean you probably wouldn't be raising that pre, but something like Jack 10 8 deuce with like diamonds, then you would probably want to raise, because now it's less likely he has flush draws, or less likely he has straight draws, a little. And then you have a little less playability on the river, or would you look at it maybe like that?
Yeah, I think that's definitely reasonable. Yeah, like Jack 10 blocking diamonds, probably go ahead and raise on the turn.
And what do you do here on the river with the second nuts? You going for the raise?
I'm a little worried that he made a royal, but I'm just gonna have to summon my courage here and hope he doesn't have a royal.
Sorry. I'm actually gonna go ahead and say third nuts. I didn't realize the royal was out there.
Oh yeah, he can't really have aces, because I don't think limp calling aces is going to be part of his strategy pre-flop. But yeah, technically, it is the third nuts.
All right. Well, that's actually how Mike McDermott got in rounders. So I mean, like you can't always look at it like that, man.
True.
Don't want to end up playing in the Chesterfield game. All right. So we raise the river, get a call, and yeah, he has a lower. But how are you feeling in his shoes when you face that river raise?
Pretty terrible. I mean, it's looking bad for you, but there's not much you can really do about it. I mean, if you just start bet folding your boats in that situation, it's going to be really easy to make a strategy that counters that. Like I could just start raising here when I have trips, or just a low flush as a bluff, or even just a good flush, just to see what happens. Because if he's folding full houses, for that price, it kind of doesn't matter. I can do whatever I want. Plus, he will have those combo draws we talked about will now have improved to some flushes that he will probably just go ahead and bet. So if he wants to bet fold value hands, he definitely has worse ones to choose from. If it was a big bet game, he could consider laying this down for sure. But given that it's 1 bet, it's going to be tough for him to get away. But he knows that he's almost always losing this pot, and he's basically calling just because of his pot odds and because it would be so exploitable to just start folding these situations.
You also get, a bad beat story, which everyone loves to hear. Okay, let's go ahead and go to our final hand. Ace, Jack, 7-4, button open, small blind fold, and pre-flop. Are you re-raising this, or are you just going for the call?
So I actually think that this is a good spot to re-raise. I believe this is like an older hand where I wasn't as aggressive, so I'm not actually sure whether I flatted or 3-bet this. I do think, especially with people opening pretty wide on the button, that when you have the suited ace and the low, and some decent high with the ace jack, that you should just go ahead and three bet.
Seems fair. You do call, face a flop bet. Top two and the second nut low draw. I have to imagine this is a pretty crystal clear check raise.
Yeah, this is a very strong hand, and we don't want any opportunities for him not to put money in the pot. Worth noting, my opponent this hand I think is more of a recreational player, which unlike the other hands, which I
bang bang bang.
Sorry out there to Lucky Lady. That was just my read at the time and now. But yeah, he goes ahead and re-raises. I think our hand is going to be good enough to just go put the 4-bet in. As we could see with some of my more aggressive plays earlier in this video, people aren't afraid to put in a light 3-bet in limit games. They'll do it with the intention to maybe not put a bet in later. So you can't shut down early versus this, because this could just be bare ace 3. I've definitely encountered players that will just 3-bet with any nut low draw on the flop.
Okay, so you do 4-bet, get the call. Interesting turn now. You turn the second nut low. Obviously, still a good turn for your high hand. I can't really imagine any way we're not just going to keep betting here.
Agreed. We're going to keep betting for sure. Now we face a raise. Now it's a little more interesting. So, the standard raise in this situation when the low gets in is you want to be in a situation where you're free rolling, where you have half the pot pretty much locked up and you have a chance at the other half. So, I mean, the best hand to have would be ace 3 of hearts, which I don't block. And, after that, a hand like ace 3 with a good high to go with it. So ace 3 with a jack, ace 3 with 2 pair, ace 3 with a straight draw. All those make sense to raise here. Once you get after ace 3 to worse lows like ace 4, you need something really strong to justify it, because you risk being the one getting free rolled. So, I mean, ace 4 with hearts is still going to raise, and my hand is probably still going to raise in his spot. But if he's playing, reasonably, he shouldn't be going too much further down the road than that. I mean, maybe like ace 5 7 7 is also defensible, or 3 4 7 7.
So what you're saying is that you're not going to be able to raise here with this hand. I mean, your opponent's range should have a ton of ace 3.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, when his range should look like sort of when my hand should be sort of towards the bottom of what wants to raise there, then obviously I can no longer put the 3rd bet in and risk the 4th bet going in.
All right,
good river.
So sorry, instinctively I went to you checking, but you didn't check. You led.
Well, I have the nut low.
So you're going to win half of this pot. This has to be like a pretty good river all in all. I mean, ace 3 is now, counterfeit. So obviously you have that beat. You do have a heart in your hand, so you block some of the flushes. Let's talk about leading versus check raising, because, in 08 we see a lot more leads than I think in most other game types. Do you ever put your value in a check raise, or are you just trying to lead and get value, or can you talk a bit about leading versus check raising?
Yeah, so leading becomes a lot more utilized in this game, because the board changes so much, and the types of hands you can both have are limited at this point. And the 3 is a really bad card for him, because he should have a lot of ace 3s when he raises the turn. And while it is a heart, now I'm really only worried about ace 4 of hearts, and he has a bunch of hands like he could have ace 3, jack 7, ace 3 jack. All these hands now have 2 pair. Some of them have a low that's worse than mine. The pot's huge. He's gonna have a hard time getting away from those hands, since he's still chopping against hands I could lead with. But if I check to him and he just has some kind of hand like that, he's certainly not going to put another bet in. He's going to be happy to take the showdown. So it is important when the board changes the card. The card changes the board. It is important to have a wide leading range there, and it's not super important to have too many traps. I think like the hands that would make some sense to check raise in theory would be kind of one-way nutted hands that are pretty safe and pretty unlikely to win the other half, in case your opponent would ever make a hero fold. in practice, that stuff doesn't really matter because people just bet call. I mean, you're going to get the showdown one way or another. So by going for a check raise, you really just open yourself up to it going check, check in that spot. So you don't really need much of a check raise range at that point.
All right, so mainly just fast play and try and get your value,
Yeah.
which you got raised.
Yeah, we got raised. So I mean, I'm pretty worried. You expect now he has the nut flush, and then he could have a four with it as well. So you should either be getting half or a quarter. I say should.
And you are getting, is that the whole enchilada?
That's the whole enchilada. So this is a really good example of how not to play your hand. His flop three bet is okay. Top pair, top kicker, decent low. It's fine. It's not the worst.
Seems maybe a little liberal though.
Yeah, it's on the light side, but it's like, at least he has a lot going for him. Once we get to the turn and he raises, now he's going way too far with it. I mean, he's got a hand that's good enough to show down. It's got a lot of equity, but like we just saw, four bets go in on the flop, and I'm leading into him on the turn. He needs to be worried about ace three, ace four, and all of those with anything with him are ahead of him with the ace five jack. So definitely a big mistake to raise the turn. He probably was inspired to do it because he had 5-8 and thought he might have some kind of free roll. When I lead into him on the river, now, I don't know, he must be looking at that ace of hearts, and he saw one too many PLO instructional videos and just thinks he's going to put me to the test here. Obviously, this isn't something that works on the river in 08 with a low possible. So, yeah, don't do that.
Yeah, bluffing seems a lot worse when there is a low out there.
Yeah, he's literally never going to get a bet fold. So it's just pretty hopeless.
Nice. So that seems like a pretty solid play here on the river. All right, so just to kind of finish off this video, let me just put this back to full screen. Let's just kind of finish up by talking about, some common mistakes that no limit players might make when they're moving over to 08, because very different game, split pot game, a lot to think about. What are when you're first moving over, because you haven't played 08 for your entire career. Obviously you played limit hold'em and no limit hold'em before that. What are some important things to be thinking about as you start to play this game?
So I think the biggest thing is just you have to get used to just going to showdown a lot more than you're used to. Like most hands are going to go to showdown, even in situations where things aren't looking good for you. You don't feel great about it. They're betting a fraction of the pot, and they could have either half of the pot and barrel. And if you start folding those because you think they're strong, it's really easy to run that strategy over by just indiscriminately betting with really any chance at anything, because once you're the person folding more of those situations, you start to be the one losing money in general, particularly in these short-handed situations like the hands that we've just reviewed. I would say another thing to look out for is you have to get used to value betting a lot more thinly. You have to bet hand like in situations where you're not really sure if you have the best hand or if you have a bluff catcher. In no limit, those are usually spots where you want to check. In limit games, you usually want to just continue betting, particularly if you have been betting, because when you check those situations, when you have the betting lead, and particularly out of position, this is true. When you check, your hand is pretty face up to be somewhere, some level of discomfort. And your opponent is going to make very efficient value bets against you because they're going to know, okay, this is ahead of these hands that he's not sure about. So even if you think you're mostly losing to their call range, as long as your hand can't check fold, it should just go ahead and bet in a lot of these situations. Now, obviously, that's kind of a generalization. There's situations where you want to check call just so you put less money in the pot. So it does kind of matter what the ranges are. So, you can't take that too far, but it is something that's a lot different than big bet.
Okay, awesome. And do you want to maybe talk a little bit about in the mixed game course, maybe talk about just like the course in general, but also what you've done with 08?
Sure. Yeah. So in the course, we go through a lot of different 08 situations, kind of breaking it down from pre-flop to flop to turn to river, going over just common scenarios you find yourself in a lot, and talking also about sort of what frequencies you want depending on what type of game you're in and what seat you're in. Um, it's going to be much different, the hands that you want to play, 10-handed early position than kind of these 3-handed games. And also, something that we go into a lot is on the button. Depending on what types of players are in the blinds, you can actually use two broadly different strategies of how tight or loose you want to be. And it's one of the more kind of rare spots in poker where it can be correct to change your strategy rather massive way, depending on your game conditions. So that's definitely an interesting thing about '08 that I don't really think much about that is out there right now. Really not much in general, but particularly some of these more advanced concepts I think are pretty hard to find.
Yeah, I mean, I think I could say pretty safely this is the best mixed game course ever created, and that bar is pretty low because I don't know if there is one out there.
Yeah, I'm not sure. There's not a ton out there. There's some things, but nothing quite comprehensive like what we've put together here.
Okay, awesome. So that's going to bring us to the conclusion of today's little coaching session. If you guys are interested in checking out the mixed game course, it's going to be launching on January 3rd at Upswing Poker. And if you're interested in learning more about the upcoming mixed game course, there's a link in the description below. All right, Jake, thank you for the help today and all the advice on how to play '08.
Thanks. It was fun.
Hope you guys enjoyed that video. The course is now live on Upswing, and if you're interested in checking it out, the link is in the description below. All right, guys, have a good one, and I'll see you later.